Before she was a legend whispered in the quiet data vaults of Strategic Command, she was a ghost. They saw a girl, a recruit with no rank and eyes that held the stillness of deep stone, and they dismissed her. But when the mountain began to scream and their steel fortress became a tomb, when the Major's commands were nothing but the echoes of failing pride, it was the ghost they turned to. They learned that day that some weapons are not forged in fire, but in silence and calculation, and that the most dangerous thing in that dying mountain was the quiet woman they had mistaken for a child. They learned this when a desperate voice from a dying world called out a name, a code that cracked the shell of her anonymity. Iron Wolf, stand ready. And Iron Wolf was ready. The air in Deepwatch Station Kilo 7 was a dead thing, recycled into a pale imitation of life. It carried the trinity of subterranean smells, the sterile bite of ozone from the server farms, the damp mineral tang of weeping rock, and the faint, cloying scent of too many stressed bodies confined in a steel drum buried 2 kilometers beneath the granite teeth of the Acrian Range. For 3 weeks, this had been Alara's world. She sat at a non-standard terminal, a small island of custom hardware she had assembled herself, tucked away in the forgotten corner of the primary command center. Her station was an anomaly, a node of quiet intensity in a room buzzing with the low-grade, performative anxiety of soldiers. The main chronometer on the forward wall pulsed a soft, clinical red, counting down the seconds of their shared isolation. Her fingers moved with an unnerving economy across the keyboard, the soft clicks a counter-rhythm to the droning hum of the station's life support. On her screen, there was no tactical map displaying troop movements, no chatter from reconnaissance drones. There was only the mountain. It was rendered not as a geographic feature, but as a living system of stresses and resonant frequencies, a complex 3-dimensional lattice of light that pulsed in time with a heartbeat too slow for any living thing. She was watching the bones of the world, listening for the whisper of its breaking. The data streamed from thousands of piezoelectric sensors drilled into the bedrock, a torrent of information that would have been meaningless noise to anyone else. To Alara, it was a language. She read the subtle shifts in shear wave velocity, the microfractures forming and healing deep within the plutonic rock, the almost imperceptible changes in the geothermal gradient. She was a cartographer of forces, mapping a battlefield no one else knew existed. The others in the command center gave her a wide berth. They were soldiers, men and women of the 77th Mountain Infantry, clad in crisp fatigues and defined by the rank on their collars. They saw a slight woman in a plain, unmarked gray jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe functional knot. They saw a civilian contractor, or perhaps a low-level tech, someone's forgotten niece assigned to a make-work project. Her stillness was unsettling. She rarely spoke, never ate in the main mess, and moved through the narrow corridors of the station with a fluid silence that made her seem to appear and disappear. She was an irregularity, a variable they could not account for in the rigid equation of military life. Their dismissal of her was a palpable thing, a pressure in the air as real as the weight of the mountain above. The source of that pressure, the pole star of their collective disdain, was Major Corbin. He strode into the command center as if he were invading it. His boots struck the grated floor with an aggressive, proprietary clang. He was a man built of right angles and loud pronouncements, his jaw perpetually set in a mask of stern impatience. His uniform was immaculate, his medals a small, boastful constellation on his chest. He saw the world as a series of objectives to be taken, problems to be solved with overwhelming force and unwavering adherence to protocol. Nuance was a weakness, and silence was suspicion. Corbin's gaze swept the room, a drill instructor's inspection meant to find fault. It snagged on Alara, a familiar irritation. He detested her corner of the room. It was unsanctioned, its purpose opaque. She had arrived with a sealed data slate of orders from high command that had simply stated she was to be given unrestricted access to the station's sensor network and provided with whatever technical resources she required. The orders were authenticated, but they were also an affront. They bypassed his authority, inserting this quiet, unnerving woman into his command without explanation. He saw her not as an asset, but as a flaw in the system, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his control. He marched over to her station, his shadow falling across her screens. The lattice of light reflecting in his polished boots seemed to mock him with its incomprehensible complexity. "Technician," he began, his voice a blunt instrument designed to hammer compliance into his subordinates. He did not use her name. He likely did not know it. "I want a report. What is the purpose of this display? High command may have sent you, but I am in command of this station. I will not tolerate black boxes in my C&C." Alara did not look up immediately. Her focus remained on a cascading series of numbers in the corner of her main display, her eyes tracking the decay of a specific harmonic resonance signature. The delay was fractional, but in the hyper-aware environment of the command center, it was a profound act of defiance. Every head in the room, pretending not to watch, was now acutely aware of the confrontation. The low hum of the station seemed to deepen, the silence stretching thin. Finally, her fingers stopped. She turned her head slowly, her gaze lifting to meet his. Her eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, and held an unnerving lack of deference. They were not defiant, but simply analytical. She was looking at him with the same detached focus she gave her seismic data, as if measuring his mass and density. "Major," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a strange acoustic property that cut through the ambient noise. It was flat, devoid of inflection. "I am monitoring subterranean stress patterns and resonant frequencies." Corbin's jaw tightened. The answer was a fact, but it was also a dismissal. It offered no deference, no explanation he could grasp. "In English, technician. What are you looking for? Enemy movements? Tunneling activity?" He was trying to force her work into a paradigm he understood, a box marked military intelligence. "No," she replied, the single word hanging in the air. She offered nothing more. She was not being insubordinate in a way he could punish. She was simply being precise. The truth was that she was not looking for anything he could comprehend. She was watching for the signature of a weapon system so far beyond conventional understanding that to explain it would be to invite ridicule and a psych evaluation. So she remained silent. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Every piece of equipment, every person in this station serves one purpose: to support the mission of the 77th. You are occupying valuable space and resources. Your presence here is an anomaly I have tolerated. That tolerance is at an end. You will integrate your work into my tactical display. I want actionable intelligence, not geological light shows. Is that understood?" A young lieutenant, eager to please, glanced nervously between the major and the silent woman. Sergeant Reyes, the communications chief, subtly angled his body away from the confrontation, his eyes fixed on his own console. But Alara noted the minute tension in his shoulders. He was listening. He had seen her work before, late at night, and had asked a few intelligent questions. He was the only one. Alara's gaze did not waver. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not agreement. It was an acknowledgement that sound had been produced in her vicinity. For her, the conversation was over. She turned back to her screen, her attention drawn to a new anomaly, a high-frequency tremor originating far to the east, propagating through the mantle at an unnatural velocity. It was faint, a whisper on the edge of detection, but its signature was clean, synthetic. It was wrong. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the signal, cross-referencing its frequency with a classified library buried deep in her system's encrypted partitions. A match bloomed on the screen, a single, terrifying word. Mjolnir. Corbin stood there for a moment longer, rendered impotent by her placid refusal to engage. He was a hammer, and she was water. He could strike, and she would simply yield and reform, her calm surface undisturbed. He grunted, a sound of pure frustration, and turned on his heel, his boots striking the floor with renewed fury. "I want this place squared away," he barked to the room at large, reasserting his authority over those who would bend to it. "Reyes, run a full diagnostic on all comms relays. I want 100% signal integrity. Now!" Sergeant Reyes snapped to attention. "Yes, Major." But as Corbin stormed toward his private office, Reyes chanced a look toward Alara's corner. He saw her face illuminated by the glow of her screen. He saw not the placid calm of a moment before, but an expression of absolute chilling focus. It was the look of a scientist who has just seen their most terrible hypothesis confirmed by the data. It was a look that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The Major had challenged a ghost, and the ghost was now looking into an abyss that was opening beneath their feet. The next few hours passed in a state of manufactured normalcy. Major Corbin busied himself with reports and logistical minutiae, the bureaucratic armor he wore against the unknown. He issued orders for readiness drills, for equipment checks, for all the rituals of military life that created an illusion of control. The soldiers of the 77th complied, their movements crisp and practiced, the familiar routines a comfort against the oppressive weight of the mountain and the Major's temper. The command center hummed along, a closed system convinced of its own security. But in her corner, Alara worked with a silent, frantic intensity. The Mjolnir signature was not just a signal, it was a herald. It was the name given to a theoretical class of tectonic weapon, a device capable of inducing and directing seismic energy by creating a cascading resonance failure in a planet's crust. It was a continent killer, a doomsday machine that most physicists considered a practical impossibility. Yet the signature was unmistakable. Someone had built it, and they had pointed it at the Acrian range. She modeled the wave propagation, her algorithms racing against time. The initial tremor was a targeting pulse, a way to ping the local geology and find its resonant frequency. It was like a safecracker listening to the tumblers of a vault. Once they found the right frequency, they could pump in a relatively small amount of energy, amplified by the natural harmonics of the rock itself, until the entire mountain range began to tear itself apart. Kilo 7 was not the target. It was ground zero. The station's deep earth sensors, The very tools she was using were what made this specific location the perfect place to initiate the cascade. Her analysis produced a timeline. The main energy pulse would arrive in under 1 hour. It would not feel like an earthquake. An earthquake was a chaotic release of energy. This would be a focused, coherent wave. It would first manifest as a low, pervasive hum, a sound that would seem to come from inside their own bones. Then, the station, a marvel of engineering designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike, would begin to vibrate. Not shake, but resonate, like a tuning fork. The resonance would amplify, the frequency matching the natural harmonic of the steel and concrete, until molecular bonds began to fail. The station would not be crushed by the mountain. It would be unwritten from existence. She had to warn them. But how? She had no rank, no credibility. To Corbin, she was the technician, the weird girl with the light show. To tell him that the mountain was about to sing them to death would be an act of career suicide, and more importantly, a waste of precious time. He would dismiss it as hysteria. He would demand proof that fit his worldview, and by the time he was convinced, they would all be a thin layer of atoms fused into the surrounding rock. She ran another simulation, this time modeling the station's structural integrity against the projected resonance curve. The results were stark. The outer containment shell would fail first, followed by the primary support pylons. But there was a small window, a period of about 90 seconds after the onset of the main pulse, where the central command center, with its independent inertial dampening system, would remain relatively stable before it too succumbed to the harmonic cascade. 90 seconds. Not enough time for an evacuation, not enough time for anything except to understand what was happening as they died. She looked up from her screen, her gaze sweeping across the oblivious faces in the room. The young lieutenant was laughing quietly at a joke with his corporal. The sensor operators were tracking a standard patrol drone on the surface. Sergeant Reyes was methodically checking signal strengths, his brow furrowed in concentration. They were good soldiers, following orders, trusting the system that had been built to protect them. They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. A cold, clinical calm settled over her. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. The problem was not just the impending tectonic event. It was the human element. It was Major Corbin. He was not just an obstacle. He was an active threat to their survival. His rigid, hierarchical mindset was as dangerous as the Mjolnir weapon itself. To save these people, she would first have to break his authority, and she would have to do it without a single shred of official power. She began a new set of calculations, her fingers a blur. If she could not stop the event, could she mitigate it? Could she change the station's resonant frequency? The inertial dampeners were designed for sudden impacts, not sustained, coherent vibrations. They would be useless. But the station had other systems. The massive geothermal exchange pumps, currently dormant, circulated millions of liters of supercooled fluid through a network of pipes deep beneath the station. If she could bring them online in a specific, staggered sequence, she might be able to create a counter-resonance, a disruptive pulse that would throw the station's harmonic signature into chaos. It would be a violent, brutal experience, like trying to right a capsizing ship by detonating explosives on its deck. It might tear the station apart just as surely as the Mjolnir pulse, but it might also work. It was a desperate gambit, a 1 in 1,000 shot, and it required absolute control over the station's core systems, control that was locked behind the Major's command authority. The system was designed to prevent a single, low-level technician from, for example, suddenly activating the entire geothermal exchange. She looked at the chronometer on the wall. 48 minutes. Her decision was made. She could not ask for permission. She would have to take it. She began to write a new piece of code. It was not a request for access. It was a key, a skeleton key for the station's entire network architecture. It was a dangerous, highly illegal piece of work, a worm designed to exploit a zero-day vulnerability she had noticed in the station's operating system during her first day. She had logged it in a private file, intending to report it through proper channels after her mission was complete. Now it was their only hope. The code was elegant, vicious, and utterly silent. A digital ghost designed to slip past the firewalls and sentries, unlock every door, and deliver the entire station into her hands. As she worked, the first faint tremor arrived. It was not the main pulse, but a precursor, a harmonic echo. It was so subtle that no one else felt it. It was a vibration in the deep rock, a flicker in the piezoelectric data stream. But Alara felt it in her teeth. It was the universe humming a funeral dirge. The chronometer pulsed. 32 minutes. The code was almost complete. The crisis did not arrive like a thunderclap. It began as a whisper, a low, pervasive hum that vibrated not in the ears, but in the chest, in the bones. It was the sound of 1 billion tons of granite beginning to sing. The soldiers in the command center paused, looking up from their consoles with expressions of vague unease. A coffee cup on a desk began to tremble, its contents tracing nervous circles on the surface. "What is that?" the young lieutenant asked, his voice tight. "Is that the ventilation?" Major Corbin emerged from his office, his face a mask of irritation. "Report!" he barked, his voice straining to be heard over the rising thrum. "Seismic, what are your readings?" A harried-looking specialist at the geology station stared at his screen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Major, it's impossible. We have a seismic event, but it's not an earthquake. It's a single, coherent frequency, a perfect sine wave. It's growing." The vibration intensified. A hairline crack skittered across the transparent aluminum of the main view screen. The lights flickered, casting strobe-like shadows across the panicked faces. The noise was now a deep, gut-wrenching groan, the sound of the station's structure resonating with the mountain's deadly song. This was not a tremor to be endured. It was a force that was actively unmaking them. "Damage report!" Corbin yelled, his voice edged with the first crack of uncertainty. He was a man of action, but there was nothing to shoot, no enemy to charge. His entire world, the solid, dependable bedrock of his reality, was dissolving into vibration. "Get me high command, full encryption, priority 1. Sergeant Reyes fought with his console, his knuckles white. "No good, Major. The resonance is playing hell with every frequency. I've got nothing but static. We're completely cut off." A shower of dust and small debris fell from the ceiling. A secondary monitor exploded in a shower of sparks. Panic began to coil in the air, a venomous snake. The soldiers, trained for combat, were now just terrified people trapped in a vibrating box miles underground. Their discipline was cracking under a strain for which there was no protocol. Corbin's response was textbook and utterly useless. "Seal all blast doors, full lockdown, engineering, report status on structural integrity." He was issuing commands from a playbook that no longer applied. Sealing the doors would not stop a harmonic cascade. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a picket fence. His authority, once absolute, was now just noise, another layer of chaos in the rising cacophony. "Sir, the outer pylons are showing microfractures," a voice screamed from the engineering station. "The stress is exponential. The models say we have less than 5 minutes until total structural failure." The word failure hung in the air, a death sentence. The command center, once a symbol of military power and technological might, was now a tomb counting down its final moments. The major stared at the tactical map on the main screen, which was now flickering and distorting, as if looking for an enemy that wasn't there. His worldview had no category for this. It was an act of God, a force of nature, and against that, his rank and his rules were meaningless. He was frozen, a captain watching his ship break apart beneath him, with no idea what to do. The system had failed. The orthodoxy of command and control was being vibrated into dust. In her corner, Alara watched the major's paralysis. She saw the fear in the eyes of the young soldiers. She felt the station groaning around her, the vibrations traveling up the legs of her chair, a physical manifestation of her own terrifying calculations. Her worm was complete. Her hand hovered over the execution key. This was the point of no return. To press it would be an act of mutiny. She would be seizing control of a military installation during a crisis. If she failed, if her wild theory was wrong, she would not just be responsible for their deaths. She would be branded a traitor. The floor bucked violently, throwing a man against a bulkhead. A high-pitched shriek began to emanate from the metal walls as the resonance found a new harmonic. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into the terrifying absolute blackness of the deep earth, broken only by the emergency strobes that now pulsed with a frantic, hellish rhythm. The screams began then, sharp and ragged sounds of pure terror. Now, Ilara's fingers did not tremble. She pressed the key. On her screen, a single line of text appeared. Root access granted. She was in. The station was hers. In the strobing, chaotic darkness, a single, calm voice cut through the panic. "The shaking will stop in 90 seconds, Ilara said. Her voice, though quiet, was amplified by the small, independent power cell of her personal comm unit, and it sliced through the noise with chilling precision. "The structural collapse will follow 2 minutes after that. Your commands are irrelevant, Major. You are trying to fight a wave. I am going to change the shape of the shore." A red emergency light flickered on, casting a demonic glow over the scene. All eyes turned to her. In the center of the room's chaos, she was an island of absolute stillness, her face illuminated by the green glow of her monitor. She had not seized command. In that moment of collective terror and leadership failure, authority had simply flowed to her, the only person in the room who seemed to have an answer other than screaming. Major Corbin, his face pale and slick with sweat in the red light, finally broke his paralysis. He spun to face her, his features a contorted mask of rage and disbelief. "What did you say, technician? You are relieved. Guards, arrest this woman." But the 2 soldiers he gestured toward were frozen, their eyes locked on Ilara. They were looking for salvation, not a scapegoat. They did not move. Her calm was more commanding than his fury. His authority had evaporated. He was just a loud, frightened man in a uniform. "There is no time," Ilara stated, her tone flat and clinical. Her eyes were on her screen, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, executing a rapid series of commands that made no sense to anyone watching. Sergeant Reyes, who had been staring at his dead comms panel, flinched as if struck. "Ma'am?" The word was instinctual. He didn't even realize he had said it. I am rerouting auxiliary power to the primary coolant exchange. The station's main reactor will go offline for 60 seconds. Emergency power will be intermittent. I need you to manually bypass the surge protectors for the geothermal pumps. When I give the word, you will activate them in the sequence I am sending to your terminal now. Do you understand? Reyes looked at his screen, which had flickered to life, displaying a complex, counterintuitive sequence of activation codes. It was insane. Activating the pumps in that order without surge protection could fuse every power conduit in the station. It was a violation of every safety protocol he had ever learned. He looked from his screen to the Major, who stood sputtering in impotent rage, and then to Alara. He saw the certainty in her posture, the pure, undiluted competence. He saw the only path that did not end in a crushed and silent tomb. He made his choice. Yes, ma'am, Reyes said, his voice firm. He turned to his console, his hands moving with renewed purpose. He was no longer following the Major. He was following the data. This is mutiny, Corbin bellowed, taking a step toward Alara. I will have you shot. Alara did not even look at him. Major, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational level, yet it carried over the station's death groan. The enemy is using a Mjolnir-class tectonic weapon. They have found the resonant frequency of this entire mountain range. In approximately 3 minutes, Kilo 7 will cease to exist. You can stand there and yell about protocol, or you can get out of my way. The technical term, the sheer audacity of her claim, struck Corbin dumb. He had no idea what a Mjolnir-class weapon was, but it sounded terrifyingly real. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear, not for his command, but for his life, showed in his eyes. Now, Alara commanded, her voice sharp. Reyes slammed his palm down on the manual override. Pumps are live. Bypass is engaged. Activating sequence alpha, Alara said, her fingers dancing. Deep beneath them, a colossal pump, silent for years, roared to life with a shudder that vibrated up through the floor, a counter-rhythm to the mountain's deadly hum. Sequence Bravo, now. Bravo engaged, Reyes called out. Another pump fired, this one on the opposite side of the station. The two competing vibrations met in the middle, creating a jarring, dissonant shock wave that threw everyone to the floor. The lights died completely, and for a terrifying second, the only sound was the shriek of stressed metal. It's not working! You're tearing us apart, the young lieutenant cried from the floor. Hold, Alara's voice commanded from the darkness. Sequence Charlie, now. Charlie engaged. A third and fourth pump fired in rapid succession. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. The coherent, singing vibration that had been shaking the station apart was shattered by a chaotic storm of counter-frequencies. The station lurched violently, a convulsive spasm of steel and concrete. It felt less like salvation and more like being inside a giant cocktail shaker. Alarms powered by sputtering batteries blared from every direction, a symphony of failure. But the deep, resonant hum of the mountain was gone. It had been replaced by a violent, chaotic shaking, the brutal but familiar feeling of a conventional earthquake. The focused, unmaking energy of the Mjolnir weapon had been disrupted. Alara's gambit had worked. She had not stopped the wave, but she had thrown the station out of its path, detuning it from the mountain's lethal frequency. The violent shaking lasted for another 20 seconds, a chaotic aftermath of the colliding forces, and then it began to subside. The station groaned, settling, the sounds of damage and stress echoing through the halls. But it was holding. The shrieking of metal subsided into a series of pings and creaks. A few emergency lights flickered back to life, casting long, distorted shadows. A profound silence fell over the command center, broken only by the ragged breathing of its occupants. They picked themselves up from the floor, their faces a mixture of terror, confusion, and dawning awe. They were alive. The unmaking had stopped. In the center of it all, Alara stood calmly at her station, her screen the only source of steady light. The complex lattice of the mountain's resonance was gone, replaced by the chaotic, spiky readings of a conventional seismic event. On another window, she monitored the station's structural integrity reports. The damage was catastrophic. The outer containment was breached in multiple sectors. 2 of the lower levels were completely flooded from ruptured water mains. But the central command center, the heart of the station, had survived. Major Corbin pushed himself to his feet, his uniform disheveled, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. He stared at Alara, his mouth opening and closing silently. The foundations of his world, rank, protocol, authority, had been pulverized in the last 5 minutes. He had failed, and she had succeeded. The truth of it was as stark and undeniable as the cracked view screen and the silent alarms. Sergeant Reyes looked at his own console, where the power was slowly stabilizing. He saw the damage reports, the fused conduits, the fried systems. By any measure, what they had just done was an act of controlled demolition. But he also saw the sensor readings from outside the station. He saw the seismic energy that had passed through them, a wave of such power that it should have turned them into vapor. He looked over at Alara, and for the first time, he understood that he was not in the presence of a technician. He was in the presence of a force of nature, all its own. "Threat neutralized," Alara stated, her voice returning to its usual flat tone, as if she were reporting the results of a routine diagnostic. She turned from her screen, and her gaze swept over the wrecked command center, cataloging the damage with the same dispassionate analysis she gave to rock strata. "Core structure is stable. Life support is on independent power and is functioning at 80%. We are alive." The simplicity of that last statement hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They were alive because of her. The soldiers, the specialists, the young lieutenant, they all stared at her, their fear slowly being replaced by a profound and unsettling respect. They didn't understand what she had done. Not really. It was a kind of technological magic, a spell woven from code and physics. But they understood the result. She had faced the abyss and, through sheer intellect, had forced it to blink. The silence was finally broken by the crackle of a speaker. It was Reyes's console. A single, heavily distorted signal was punching through the interference, a tight beam transmission on a frequency reserved for the highest echelons of command. It was a signal that shouldn't have been able to get through the kilometers of shattered rock above them. "Is anyone there?" A voice, tinny and laced with static, echoed through the room. "Kilo 7, do you copy? This is General Madsen, Strategic Command. Acknowledge." Major Corbin froze. General Madsen was the supreme commander of the entire theater, a near-mythical figure who operated from a command bunker half a world away. For him to be on a direct channel meant the situation was even more dire than they could imagine. Corbin, his training kicking back in, moved toward the comms panel. This was his chance to reassert control, to report the situation, to frame the narrative. "General, this is Major Corbin, Commanding Kilo 7, he began, his voice raspy. We have sustained heavy damage. We were attacked by an unknown seismic event. We have mutiny and sabotage to report, but the immediate threat appears to be... Silence, Major! The voice of General Madsen cut through Corbin's explanation with the cold authority of a man who did not have time for excuses. The static cleared for a moment, and his next words were perfectly, chillingly clear. I am not talking to you. My query is for an asset your station is hosting. I need a situation report, and I need it now. There was a pause, and then the general spoke the words that would forever alter the history of the 77th Mountain Infantry. Iron Wolf, stand ready. Report your status. Every head in the room swiveled from the speaker to Major Corbin, whose face had gone slack with confusion. Iron Wolf? It was a call sign, a designation for a high-value operative. He had no such person under his command. He had memorized the manifest of every soldier, contractor, and specialist in the station. There was no Iron Wolf. Then, in the stunned silence, a single, quiet voice responded. It was Alara. She had not moved from her station. She simply leaned forward and spoke into her personal comm unit, its signal patched directly into the main array by her own software. This is Iron Wolf, she said, her voice as calm and steady as it had been when she was explaining seismic stress. General, the Mjolnir device was activated on schedule. The target was the Acrian fault line. I have successfully mitigated the primary resonance cascade at ground zero, but the weapon's energy has propagated westward. The damage to the station is severe, but manageable. We are holding. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt louder than the previous chaos. The soldiers stared at the quiet woman in the gray jumpsuit, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the low-level technician with the reality of the calm, authoritative voice speaking directly to the highest level of command. Major Corbin looked as if he had been physically struck. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. The blood from his cut stood out like a stark red accusation against his white skin. Iron Wolf. The legendary codename belonged to a ghost, a phantom operative spoken of in hushed tones in intelligence circles. A single individual who was not a soldier, but a living weapon, deployed to solve problems that had no conventional solution. A geophysicist with a doctorate in tectonic warfare. A myth, and she had been standing in his command center for 3 weeks, and he had called her Technician. Acknowledged, Iron Wolf, General Madsen's voice replied, and there was a palpable sense of relief in his tone. Your analysis of the Mjolnir threat was correct. Your survival confirms it. What is your assessment? Can the effect be contained? Negative, General, Alara replied, her eyes already back on her screen, which now displayed a much larger map of the continental plate. My counter-resonance was a localized solution. The main energy is now propagating along the plate boundary. It will reach the San Andreas Fault in approximately 72 hours. The initial calculations suggest it will trigger a cascading rupture along its entire length. The event will be extinction level. A wave of cold horror washed through the room. They had survived their own small apocalypse, only to learn it was the herald of a global one. Understood, Madsen said, his voice grim. What do you require? The Mjolnir device is not a single-use weapon. It requires a continuous energy feed to sustain the wave, Alara explained. The source is a deep-bore geothermal tap, location unknown. But the weapon itself, the emitter array, has to be located at a nexus of tectonic stress. There are only 3 geologically viable locations in this hemisphere. I am running comparative analyses now. I will have a primary target location within the hour. And then, Madsen pressed, then you will need to destroy it, Ilara stated simply. A conventional strike will be insufficient. The emitter is likely buried as deep as this station. You will need a kinetic bombardment solution, a minimum of 3 orbital tungsten rods, targeted with geophysical precision. I will provide the exact coordinates and impact vectors. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The implications of what she was saying were staggering. She was not just advising. She was directing the deployment of strategic, planet-killing weapons as if she were ordering lunch. "And Major Corbin?" Madsen asked, his voice now like chips of ice. Ilara paused for a fraction of a second. She glanced at the Major, who was now leaning against a bulkhead, his entire body trembling. He looked broken, a man whose identity had been stripped from him in an instant. Her gaze was not triumphant, not vengeful. It was, as always, analytical. He was a variable that had been accounted for and neutralized. "The Major acted according to his training," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "His methods were insufficient for the nature of the threat. He is no longer a factor in the command chain." The statement was a masterpiece of clinical dismissal. She did not accuse him. She simply rendered him obsolete. "I see," Madsen said. "Major Corbin, you are hereby relieved of command of Kilo 7. You will relinquish all authority to Iron Wolf. You will follow her orders without question or hesitation. Your career is over. Whether or not your life is depends on your conduct in the next 72 hours. Is that clear?" Corbin could only manage a choked, strangled sound of assent. He slid down the bulkhead to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. He was no longer the commander. He was a prisoner of his own failure, a ghost in the station that was now hers. The hierarchy of rank had been demolished and replaced by the pure, undeniable hierarchy of competence. A new order settled over the wrecked command center. It was quiet, efficient, and centered entirely on the unassuming woman in the gray jumpsuit. The soldiers, who hours before had ignored her, now watched her with a reverence bordering on fear. They moved with a renewed sense of purpose, not from the blustering commands of the Major, but from the calm, precise directives she issued. "Lieutenant," she said, her eyes still on her primary screen, where complex models of the Earth's crust were resolving into a single point of light. "Organize damage control teams. I need power fully restored to the long-range sensor array. Prioritize that above all else." "Yes, ma'am," the young lieutenant replied, his voice filled with an earnestness that bordered on worship. He scurried off, shouting orders to the other soldiers, who now responded with an alacrity they had never shown for Corbin. She turned to Sergeant Reyes. "Reyes, the comms blackout was not just interference. It was a targeted electronic warfare attack designed to isolate us during the initial pulse. They will know the Mjolnir device has been partially thwarted. They will be listening. I need you to establish a closed, encrypted data link to General Madsen's command ship. Use quantum entanglement protocols if you have them. No radio frequency transmissions of any kind." Reyes stared at her. Quantum entanglement comms were a theoretical technology, a rumor whispered about in the high-level signals intelligence community. He had no idea how to even begin. He opened his mouth to say so, but then stopped. He looked at the woman who had rewritten physics to save them, and his doubt evaporated. "The access codes and hardware schematics are being transferred to your terminal now," she said, anticipating his hesitation. The components are in secure storage, level 4, subsection Delta. The station was built with the capability. It has never been activated. Reyes looked at his screen. An impossibly complex set of instructions and diagrams bloomed across it. It was all there. He nodded slowly, his mind reeling. "I'm on it," he said, and the words felt like an oath. For the next hour, Alara worked in a silent bubble of intense concentration. The others orbited her, a solar system of activity around a quiet sun. They brought her water, which she ignored. They brought her nutrient paste, which she left untouched. Her entire being was focused on the problem, on the torrent of data flowing from a world in peril. She was a grandmaster at a chessboard the size of a planet. Her opponent, an unseen, unknown enemy who had tried to checkmate humanity. Finally, she leaned back. On her screen, a single set of coordinates was highlighted, a location in the middle of a desolate, uninhabited desert on the other side of the world. A complex trajectory overlay showed 3 lines arcing down from orbit, converging on that single point with microscopic precision. "General Madsen," she spoke into her comm, her voice echoing in the now efficient command center. "This is Iron Wolf. I have the target." The final moments were a study in anticlimax. There was no grand explosion, no visual confirmation of success. There was only data. On Alara's screen, the angry red line representing the Mjolnir wave flickered, destabilized, and then vanished. It was as if a scream had been cut short. The coherent energy signature that had threatened to unwrite the world was simply gone. A profound planetary silence descended on her sensors. A collective, ragged sigh of relief went through the command center. The young lieutenant sagged against a console, his face wet with tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Someone else laughed, a short, hysterical bark of a sound. They had done it. She had done it. "Confirmation, Iron Wolf?" General Madsen's voice, now patched through on a crystal-clear, secure channel, asked. "Confirmed, General," Alara replied, her voice holding the barest hint of what might have been satisfaction, or perhaps just the finality of a completed equation. "The Mjolnir emitter has been destroyed. The tectonic wave has dissipated. The threat is neutralized." "Extraordinary work, Iron Wolf," Madsen said, and for the first time, his professional tone was broken by a note of genuine awe. "Humanity owes you a debt it can never repay." "I was doing my job, General," she replied, already closing the targeting files and opening a new set of diagnostics. For her, the crisis was over. Now, the analysis began. The work was never truly done. In the quiet aftermath, as repair teams worked to bring the station back to a semblance of functionality, a new culture took root in the shattered corridors of Kilo 7. The blustering, performative hierarchy of Major Corbin was a forgotten memory. In its place was a quiet, focused respect for competence. The soldiers spoke in lower tones. They moved with more purpose. They had looked into the void and been saved not by a commander, but by a calculator. A day later, as Alara was recalibrating the station's gravimetric sensors, Sergeant Reyes approached her corner. He did not speak for a long moment, simply watching her work. He held out a steaming mug. It was real coffee, brewed from a private stash he must have kept for special occasions. It was the first sign of normal life returning. Alara looked up from her screen, her gray eyes meeting his. She paused, then slowly took the mug, her fingers wrapped around its warmth. It was a small human gesture in the midst of cold, hard physics and global threat assessments. "The quantum comms," Reyes said, his voice quiet. "The theory behind the data compression, I've never seen anything like it. It's 20 years ahead of anything we have in the field." "It is efficient," Alara said, taking a small sip of the coffee. It was black and bitter, and it tasted like victory. "I was wondering," Reyes continued, his hesitation a form of respect, "if you could show me the math behind it." It was the ultimate acknowledgement. He was not praising her. He was not thanking her. He was asking to learn from her. He was recognizing her not as a savior or a myth, but as a source of knowledge. For Alara, it was the highest form of praise. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "When the diagnostics are complete," she said, it was a promise. A new hierarchy had been established, one based not on the rank on one's collar, but on the data in one's head. The extraction team arrived a week later. They were not soldiers. They were quiet men and women in the same gray jumpsuits as Alara, and they moved with the same unnerving silence. They spoke to no one, their eyes holding the same analytical distance. They were her people. She packed her small kit, wiped her custom terminal, and prepared to leave. The station she had saved was already becoming a memory, a closed data file in the vast archive of her mind. As she walked toward the transport that would take her back to the surface, she passed what had been Major Corbin's office. The door was open. He was inside, packing his personal effects into a small, plain box. He looked up as she passed, and their eyes met. His face was hollow, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a tired, defeated man. He did not speak. He simply gave a slow, formal nod. It was a gesture of surrender, a final silent admission of her complete and total vindication. Alara did not acknowledge it. She did not need to. His defeat was not her victory. It was simply the outcome of a logical process. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the transport without a backward glance. She had arrived as a ghost, an anomaly. She left as a legend, but she was still a ghost, destined to move from one crisis to the next, a silent guardian watching the deep, fragile structures of the world. Her purpose was not to be known, but to know, and in knowing, to act. The work was all that mattered. The work was all there was.